welcome back to the second webinar of our challenge on international cooperation, looking today at inclusive governance. So we've got a really great panel looking at civil rights, minority representation, human rights and youth participation. So we've got a real whirlwind tour of some of the key issues today. Each speaker is going to give a short presentation and at the end, when all three have spoken, we'll have a Q&A. And we shouldn't be keeping you any longer than an hour. Few housekeeping notes. We'll be recording this session, but as usual, it's just going to be circulated amongst CFC members, so it won't be publicly distributed. And when it gets to the Q&A, if your connection gets bad, just turn off your camera and type it in the chat. And just a reminder that if you're not speaking, to please make sure that you mute yourself. I think we will jump right into it. And I will introduce our three speakers. So today we are joined by Dr. Halima Begum, who has led the Runnymede Trust since 2020. She began her career as a researcher on the influential Commission on the Future of a Multi-Ethnic Britain, before going on to fill senior roles in the UK Department for International Development, British Council and the Lego Foundation. She spent much of her career on overseas posting. I think she's just come back from East Africa. So we're very grateful to have her here despite her traveling, and headed major development, research and policy programs in fields including human rights, food insecurity, gender equality, poverty reduction, and much, much more. Also joined by David Griffiths, who is an associate fellow here at Chatham House in the International Law Programme. And he's a consultant on human rights strategy. He's a member of OSCE's panel of experts on freedom of religion of belief. Previously, David worked at Amnesty International as director of the Office of the Secretary General, and before that as the organization's deputy director for Asia, where he began the process of establishing a regional office in Sri Lanka. So welcome, David. And finally, we have Sophie Daud, who is the award-winning Chief Executive Officer of the Future Leaders Network, who I believe many of you are involved in or have attended an event we've done in collaboration with them in the past. In 2021, she was appointed as the chair of the Y7, the official youth engagement group for the UK government's G7 presidency. Under Sophie's leadership, the Future Leader Network has engaged over 50,000 young people over just 6 months, delivering inclusive, developmental and impactful youth summits. So really a lot of variety of expertise here today. And I will first hand over the floor to Dr. Halima.
Thank you, Katie. And it's a real pleasure to be invited back at Chatham House and to be with you here today for this incredibly important discussion. So I'm going to start with a few points that might go straight into the topic, because I know that this is supposed to be a more dynamic discussion. So no set pieces from me, but some insights that I hope will get us going. So before I took the chance to look at a few random international organizations to look at who is their current leadership. And I say random because if I had done a more systematic review, you could say it's scientific, but random ones also sometimes show a kind of snapshot of the leadership that we currently have. So I looked at the current leadership of the OECD, the World Bank, UNHCR, UNICEF Global Headquarters, and a couple of NGOs, British NGOs, and almost all of them, with the exception of the World Bank, which has recently recruited a US national who is Indian American. The rest of these organizations that I randomly checked actually had mainly Caucasian leaders, not necessarily white males, but female white Caucasian leaders. I checked about 6, by the way, so it wasn't scientific. Does that necessarily mean that they couldn't be inclusive leaders? Now, that's really the kind of challenge question for us. I don't necessarily think that they couldn't be. But what matters is that these leaders go into those roles with something of a mandate for equitable leadership and actually driving inclusion agendas across the piece. So what we really need to be holding them accountable for is not just their representativeness and whether they are representative of the population, but whether they also carry through an equalities mandate. I've recently been working, well, about a year and a half ago with Amy Pope, who is now the designate Director General for the International Organization for Migration. And part of Amy's kind of leadership work before she was put up for the nomination was to look at equity across the UN's Organization for Migration. It's a really difficult piece of work. And I imagine that emerging leaders and existing leaders these days have to really demonstrate their leadership capabilities and credentials through an equitable lens. First thing. Now, of course, that then means a lot is relying on the individual leader. And we know that leaders are more than, organizations are more than its leadership, really. Because if we're relying too much on the individual to carry through inclusive governance culture, then I think we're probably all going to burn out. Organization cultures matter. Where power sits in an organization matters. And in the international system, unfortunately, most international organizations probably are embedded within a power system already that kind of comes before the individual who is then sitting in the leadership role. So the international system, I guess, system of nation states that are leading through it isn't necessarily an equal playing field. So that makes inclusive governance particularly difficult. And when you're looking for inclusive governance, I do think you have to unpack some of the traditional hard power that is that is in the DNA of international institutions. So if we are looking at the World Bank, there's probably one nation state that carries a lot of power. If we're looking at UNESCO, it's probably another nation state that carries a lot of power. If we're looking at the International Organization for Migration, a different nation state. So in some ways, I think if we want to look at international institutions and how inclusive they are, you have to have that honest conversations about who actually wields power. And then through that, look at how we might then create a more inclusive culture. I myself am moving into a leadership role myself this summer of an international NGO that's called ActionAid. Some of you might know about it. And of course, there are great expectations on me to be an inclusive leader. Now, I could rest on my laurels a bit because representatively, I come from a racialized minority group within the UK. Job done, you might argue, but actually I'm pretty nervous. I'm pretty nervous that those high expectations of me need a lot of work, and I mustn't rest on my laurels. So I'll be working really hard across the organization with all of the constituent staff members, the leadership group, our followers, our supporters, to think through what sort of an organization ActionAid wants to be. Now, ActionAid is an organization that's informed by feminist leadership values. Feminist leadership values are incredibly intersectional. They're about sharing power, redistributing power, making sure that those with less power have a voice at the table. That's hard work. I'm not saying that it's all done just because we've said that, the organization is informed by feminist leadership values, but it is work in progress. I'll have to come back to you in about 3 or 4 years' time, and for you to be really the judge of whether I've been effective and successful. But I take it very, very seriously that just because I am a minoritized leader, it doesn't mean my job is done and I can sit back and think that representation alone is what matters. And I suppose what I'm getting to there is this notion that's very present these days that's around representation and diversity, as though if you hire more diverse leaders or more youthful leaders or more women leaders, the job of equity is done. It's not done. Some of you will be reading the newspapers this week around the Supreme Court's decision in America to strike down affirmative action for higher education institutions and universities. The irony there was that actually 2 of the Supreme Court judges themselves were the beneficiaries of affirmative action. So where are we now in 2023 when we're actually striking down affirmative action decisions in the US itself? I hope the rest of the world doesn't follow. But what's important there, and this is what I wanted to leave you with in discussion around inclusive governance, is this. Imagine a marathon. I'm running a marathon and alongside me is a disabled runner. And I say to the disabled runner, it's equal opportunities for you and I. It's a level playing field, let's race. How on earth is that an equitable or fair race if my fellow runner is disabled and I am not, but we're expected to run the same marathon in life? That's why that Supreme Court decision was so wrong, so unfair, so intuitively wrong. So I do hope that leaders of organizations within our international system understand the value of fairness and what it means to be inclusive. It is not about running a conversation around culture wars and winning votes through it. It is actually about designing an international system that feels equitable and fair in order for us to shape and reimagine a better society.
Thank you so much. That's, I think, a really good kind of initial starting point for our discussion today, thinking about kind of representation and what does inclusion actually practically mean. I think we'll move on to David now, who I'll hand over the floor to. So, David.
Thanks, Katie, and great to meet you all and to be here with you. I've heard a little bit about this group. It sounds fantastic. And kudos to all of you for participating in this, and I hope you've been finding it really fruitful, and look forward to the discussion that we're going to have now. I'm going to talk about a slightly different, or come at this question from a slightly different perspective, and talk about inclusive governance in relation to human rights. Two reasons for that, for approaching this from that perspective. The first is that this is a really significant year for human rights as we approach the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. That will be on the 10th of December. And that's a really significant moment for kind of thinking about what human rights have delivered to the world so far, and also to reflect upon the future of human rights. And with that in mind, Chatham House has had a project over the last couple of years called Human Rights Pathways, which is looking at the way forward for human rights. I've been part of that in my capacity as an associate fellow. And what I'm going to talk about now links a little bit to two reports that I have done. One is called Human Rights Diplomacy, Navigating an Era of Polarization. And the other is 10 Big Ideas for the Renewal of Human Rights. This one you can find on the website and read, this one you can't. But hopefully you'll be able to find a version of it soon if you're interested. So what are the relationships between human rights and inclusive governance? Well, I think, to answer that question, we have to look first at the purposes and the uses of human rights, which fundamentally are a form of recourse against the abuse of power. They should be, they are held by everybody universally, and provide a kind of non-anarchic way of navigating the relationship between people and power. So in that sense, human rights should be very much about securing a more inclusive world, a world in which everybody has recourse against injustices and the systems of inequity in our world. Secondly, human rights are a transnational framework which embodies ideals of accountability, dignity, equality, and justice. So really there's so much within the human rights framework and human rights system that enables us, in theory at least, to realize a more inclusive world, and a world in which people's relationship to power is healthy and is not skewed against people in favor of those who abuse their power. And the third thing really is that human rights are a system with multiple different methodologies. There are different ways of using human rights. On the one hand, human rights are a language which help to describe moral ideals. They can help us to set out vision for where we want to go as a society, as a world, but they also provide very practical tools, mechanisms, and so on for restraint of injustice. And so, in that sense, there are very different modes of using human rights, both to envision and to kind of hold back the bad stuff. So in that sense, I think the human rights system, which we're reflecting upon particularly this year, is a really important piece of the overall global picture of realizing inclusive governance in the world. The question is, what stands in the way of the effectiveness of human rights at this time. And that's been one of the kind of underlying questions for this Chatham House project, because as we come to this 75th anniversary of the UDHR, we're very conscious of a sense of malaise around human rights in the world, a sense that they have not delivered upon their promise, and that perhaps the best days of human rights are behind us. And I think there are, again, three things that I want to reflect on briefly here that really are standing in the way of the effectiveness of human rights. The first, which is covered in that report on human rights diplomacy, which is really kind of a report on human rights politics, the international politics of human rights, is the extent of politicization and polarization around human rights, and how they have been caught up in great power politics in the world, which is really working against the effectiveness of human rights as a system for ordinary people to have recourse against the abuse of power. Now, human rights have always been politicized. It's kind of in their nature as a state-to-state system, but the extent of the polarization today, I think, is a real betrayal of the promise of human rights. The report, if you're interested, sort of gives a bit of a history through those 75 years of how we've reached the moment that we're in now, looking at the period of decolonization and the Cold War, when the human rights framework came together. And in that period, we often sort of talk about it in the historiography as the Cold War period, the US against the Soviet Union, and two sides kind of championing different versions of human rights. But really, you know, when the human rights project was floundering in the 1960s, it was the energy of decolonization that kept it alive. The first international covenant in human rights was not the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or on Economic and Social Rights, which make up the International Bill of Rights, but it was the International Covenant for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And so right from the beginning, really, human rights has been very bound up in an aspiration to create a more equitable world and to deal with the legacies of colonialism and racism that's encoded into our international system. It was only really in the 90s that we saw human rights agenda globally really dominated by the United States, and a kind of association made in our minds between ideas of human rights, freedom, and democracy, as though these are all the same thing. We're in a different time now, but there is a new kind of bifurcation within human rights between the US view of human rights and democracy on the one hand, and China's view of which is sort of picking up an old idea from the African continent of the right to development and human rights as a pathway to development. And both of those make a sort of reasonable pairing with human rights, but both of them are very incomplete and a sort of a betrayal of the holistic vision of human rights, which is what we need in order to pursue a more equitable and inclusive world. So the extent to which human rights has been kind of somewhat betrayed by great power politics is a real problem today. The second challenge I think we face is the elite capture of human rights. What should be a framework for pushing against the abuse of power has become associated with institutions that often represent the status quo and the politically powerful. And I think one example of this that I'm familiar with from my previous work in Amnesty International was in Afghanistan, where human rights was kind of part of the package that was brought by the quote unquote international community, which didn't turn out to be much of a community where it really mattered. But at that time, you know, that is sort of setting up human rights as something of the powerful, and not something which necessarily serves those who really need it. And the third thing that sort of flows from both of those challenges, the politicization, polarization, and the elite capture, is the fact that we've become content with a very narrow human rights agenda, and a failure of imagination in fulfilling the very vibrant promise of human rights. And there's a risk, I think, that human rights as conceived today no longer truly reflect people's lived experiences of injustice and inequality. And that's something that we really need to get to grips with and to address at this significant anniversary. So let me just give a few ideas of what we need to do in order to redeem the promise of human rights as a framework for inclusivity and justice in the future. And I've got 6 things which I will run through very quickly. The first is, I think we need an ambitious agenda. We need to think about using human rights tools to tackle the grand global challenges that we're facing today. And I include among those growing economic inequality, the climate crisis and its close cousin, the biodiversity crisis, and the challenges put in front of us by technology, changing what it means for us to be human in so many ways. The second thing is about really standing upon the principles of solidarity and subsidiarity, pushing back against the elite capture of human rights and listening to those who are closest to the harms, allowing them to set the agenda within human rights. And here I think we have a lot to learn from the movement of the rights of people with disabilities, which coined the phrase, "nothing about us without us." And that's the principle that we would do well to really inculcate throughout all human rights work. The third thing is around protecting and safeguarding the role of civil society. And this is connected, but a little bit different from the previous point. But at a time when civil society is increasingly locked out of the places where decisions are made and where power is held, upholding access, strengthening participation, and providing protection for civil society is a really important agenda. The fourth thing is about demanding responsive institutions. And we need to make sure that the human rights institutions that we have are properly funded. We need to stop bashing them, but we also need to ask a lot from them. And I think that's the kind of relationship that we need to have with human rights institutions, which are often under assault, but are often also guilty of being part of the elite capture, if you like. The fifth point is about the importance of interdisciplinary approaches. We, I think, are beginning to realize that it's no longer in any way plausible to divide up the world in terms of human rights, climate, development, peace, etc., but starting to see the interconnections between these things and to think and operate in a much more holistic way. That means human rights people talking to economists and development specialists and vice versa, and so on and so forth. There's a lot more to say about that. And sixth and finally, I think it's important for us to broaden the horizons in terms of our human rights work. And that goes to my earlier point about the narrowness of the agenda. But I think it's also about a focus on intergenerational justice at a time when that's the importance of that has become extremely clear. And I think perhaps also challenging the anthropocentrism, the human centrism of human rights. And perhaps it's time to think about a more inclusive vision of human and planetary flourishing in which human rights can play a part. So that's what I had to say. And I think that the headline is that I hope that the human rights system so recalibrated can play a really important part in inclusive governance and in creating a more equitable and inclusive world. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David. That was such a great overview of not only the challenges that we're facing, but a kind of potential way forward, which is quite hopeful and like a really nice change. I think it's now Sophie's turn, so I will hand over the floor to Sophie.
Thanks so much, Katie, and thank you, David and Halima. So much interesting stuff to chew over there. And I'll hopefully try and kind of pick up on a few of those points throughout. So my name is Sophie Daud, and I'm kind of in the business of like global governance. So Katie mentioned at the start of this that I chaired the youth engagement into the UK's G7 presidency. The G7 is the group of 7. It's a group of the world's most advanced democracies who come together every year to kind of solve the world's biggest problems. But I also support all of the youth engagement on behalf of the UK into the G20. And through my work as co-founder of the Youth Negotiators Academy, I also support kind of youth participation in UN processes. And I guess it's always helpful to start with kind of recollecting why global governance matters. And actually it matters because all of the biggest problems that we are facing right now are global issues. By that, I mean, when we're talking about the kind of cost of living crisis, we are also deeply interconnected right now, that our economies and the kind of standards of living and poverty are so interconnected in terms of the way the world works. We're also feeling the kind of intense pressure of if you think about geopolitics, that is a global issue. And if you're thinking about climate change, that is a global issue. The problem is that pretty much on all fronts, or on many fronts on global issues right now, it can feel like we're stalling a little bit. So we're seeing increasing geopolitical tension and uncertainty. We're seeing the cost of living crisis all around the world. We're seeing that the recovery from COVID-19, which was a global issue, I mean, what happened to Build Back Better? The world doesn't feel like we've come out in an optimistic and positive place. And then lastly, when it comes to climate change, I mean, we're facing, our 28th Conference of Parties that's happening in Dubai later this year. That's 28 years that it's taken us to reach where we are. Why haven't we gone further? By all scientific accounts, we are nowhere near what we need to be at to reduce emissions and to prevent catastrophic climate change. So global governance matters because all the big issues of today are kind of dictated in, to a greater or less extent by global governance. And it currently doesn't feel like we're doing a very good job of it. I think what's really interesting is in terms of inclusive governance, there's definitely this kind of moral and ethical grounds for why we should have more inclusive governance, right? I think there's a human rights angle that David has really kind of aptly touched upon. And also Halima, something that I really took from what you were talking about was around this kind of human potential element and enabling every individual to thrive. And I think what's kind of irritating is often those what I encounter is that those arguments don't always fly, and actually people are always looking for a kind of instrumental value of inclusive governance. And you see this quite a lot in business. They were kind of a bit anti inclusion until suddenly they realized that actually diversity and inclusion was better for their bottom line. And the interesting thing is, I genuinely believe that inclusive governance in business, the benefits of it transfer also to inclusive governance in the global context. So there's plenty of studies that show that more diverse teams actually reach better decisions, they deliver faster decisions, and they achieve better results. So above and beyond what I think is morally the right thing to do, there is also a really kind of consequentialist angle to this, which is that inclusive governance is good, mostly is good for everyone. And I think, when it comes to decision making and when it comes to global governance, what type of inclusion do we want? So we've seen really strong progress in the field of women's participation in global governance. I hear you, Halima, on many other factors that definitely not at play, not improved. But I think there's lots of areas where we've seen actually, we've been able to take dramatic steps in improving diverse groups' access to leadership positions in global governance. One of the things that I and lots of other young people around the world are thinking about is what if we could bring the urgency and the impatience of youth into international decision making, into global governance? It's really interesting. Just 2.6% of the world's parliamentarians are under the age of 30. That is despite the fact that young people make up around 50% of the world's population, about 56% if you count under 35s. I mean, that is enormous, and yet they account for just 3% really of global decision makers, which is actually quite horrifying. And we kind of came across this idea of what if we could bring more young people into decision-making positions? We could bring the urgency, their impatience into the global multilateral context. And I genuinely think we would make better decisions. So that's the kind of fundamental premise of all of the work that I do. And I think there are a couple of barriers, right? What are the things that make that hard? Or rather, what are the things that you have to overcome to make this easier? In the same way that, when we were talking, and we still talk about, empowering women in the workplace, there are some kind of systemic barriers that you cannot just expect that women as individuals will be able to overcome, that we have to systemically transform the system to remove those barriers to ensure effective participation. Because as Halima really rightly pointed out, representation is not enough. We need inclusion as well. So let me talk you through a couple of the things that I've definitely encountered in supporting more young people into leadership positions in global governance. First is really practical. financial resources. Right. So young people are often at the start of their career. They are more likely to be in low paid or precarious work. Often the things that you need to do to get into leadership positions are the things that also require a bit of money. Those unpaid internships, those connections to a friend of a friend, the ability to just hang out at a conference all day whilst you're connecting with interesting people, those things you need to have time and resources to be able to do. And young people tend to actually be the least able to do so. So tackling that and providing those kind of infrastructural resources to enable young people to participate in decision making are absolutely crucial. So some of the things that we talk about a lot is like paying young people for their time. So lots of young people get invited to be on a youth board here or to support as like a shadow board member, and they're expected to do it for free. Now, we know that the company or the organization loves this because it helps them with how they're selling their, corporate social responsibility. And of course, it helps them make better decisions. And they kind of expect that the young person will do that for free. But in the reality, this is all about trading value, and young people bring immense value. And we need to recognize that and equip them with the things accordingly. The second thing that we encounter quite a lot is stigma. So often when our young leaders walk into a room, someone goes like, but where's so-and-so? Like, where's the boss? And they're like, well, I am the boss. And there's this really awkward moment where people just don't think about, don't expect this young person to be able to genuinely take decisions and lead. And so I do a lot of work working with kind of senior leaders. So I go around to kind of executive boards and other senior leadership teams and talk about the value that young people can bring, because unless we change mindsets, we are putting all of these barriers in place to young people's participation effectively in global governance. But then there's a couple of other things that are really important. So the third thing is capacity building. So young people are phenomenal. They have immense value and expertise in and of themselves, but often, especially in international governance, kind of length of service is used as a proxy for quality. The reality is what length of service is a proxy for is experience, and experience can be developed in a number of ways. So if you think about, I don't know, like advanced footballers, right? I mean, like if you're on the Premier League football pitch, it's because you've done an absurd amount of structured practice. That's not the same as someone who is 50 or 60 who's kicked a ball around once a week with his mates in the park. And what's really interesting there is that length of service, length of time playing, does not equate to actual competence of the individual in that skill. And so capacity building is really, really important, because we can equip young people with all of the skills and the knowledge and capabilities they need to lead really effectively on a global stage. We just need to give them the equivalent of like the Premier League Academy, the kind of really intensive support to enable them to have the skills that they need. And this is my background, so leadership development. I have seen time and time again young people developing these incredible leadership skills in a very short space of time. But maybe last but not least, what we think we need to have more inclusive governance, more young people in decision making, is community. And again, this links back to Halima's point around culture. I think culture is so important, and community matters. So I genuinely believe that leadership is as much about who you know as what you know. And governance is exactly the same. And young people often can miss out on some of the skills, on some of the connections that maybe their counterparts have had for the last 40 years. So we need to create these communities of young leaders who are self-supporting, peer learning, but also can help each other to achieve some of the kind of infrastructure networking goals that we really, really need. Maybe I'll conclude by saying, like, what's the kind of the prize for getting this right? And I think if we do get this right, if we do support more young people, and of course, in general, more diverse people into governance and into decision-making positions, we both enable people to fulfill their individual potentials. We create a system of kind of systematic justice, both intergenerationally. I really like that you picked that up, David, so thank you. But also geographically, right? So some of the world's developing countries are also its youngest. Young people are kind of a burgeoning and blooming population in all different parts of the world. And actually that kind of geographical and whole holistic sense of justice is also really important if we bring young people to the mix. But maybe I'll also talk about a kind of converse. So like, what if we get this wrong? And young people are those who have had they've seen a massive decline in their satisfaction with democracy. If I just talk maybe about a couple of the like big institutional democratic things. So 1 in 5, so only 1 in 5 young people in the UK have confidence in the group of 7 to tackle shared problems. Just 25% of young people in the UK have trust in the UK government. I mean, I'm using facts from the UK, but I'm pretty confident those will be mirrored all around the world. Young people are increasingly dissatisfied with democracy and increasingly dissatisfied with the way that they are governed. And the really important problem with that is that governance depends on citizens' agreement to be governed. And we need to restore that faith, that trust in democratic processes, because without that, we will undermine the ability of those processes to achieve action. And maybe this is the lovely bit where I'll leap right back to the beginning. If those institutions, those global governance institutions, can't take action, then how on earth are we going to solve the biggest problems of our time? How on earth are we going to tackle climate change or global poverty or the cost of living crisis or geopolitical uncertainty? We have to think about inclusive governance, because that's the only way that governance will continue to exist. Thanks.
I think that's such a profound point to leave us on for this portion of the discussion. Some really incredible points. I love how you can see the intersections between all 3 of your presentations there. Just a reminder, if anyone would like to ask a question, make a comment, just put your hand up if you're able to speak, or just put it into the chat box. I think I'll use my position as chair to ask a question first. This one's for Halima and Sophie. I'm just wondering if you think it's possible to move towards the more meaningful engagement that you were speaking about with diverse and marginalized groups within the current system, or is the system the problem? And should that be where we're focusing our efforts on changing the system itself? I'll start with Halima and then I'll go to you, Sophie.
I think systems and individuals interact together, don't they? So you can't just have systems without leaders, and you can't have leaders that operate outside of a system. So in some ways, I think you've got to think about leaders that really understand the changing context in which we're operating in, and a style of leadership that's not about what they read in McKinsey 20 years ago. There was that alpha notion of leadership that we're all familiar with. A particular style of diplomacy that Henry Kissinger was very famous for. I mean, all of that stuff really does belong to the 20th century. So I think individual leaders these days would need to understand the changing context of what leadership is. Now, then thinking about how you lead through a system, and a system that's very international is quite the challenge. But I think it is not impossible. I think we've got to let go of certain ways of doing things, certain ways of leading. And I think in many ways, we've got to listen to external movements, whether that's the climate movement, whether that's the Black Lives Matter movement, whether that's a movement of indigenous groups of farmers in a particular part of the world defending their right to space in a particular way. Without listening to those concerns, even the best of leaders won't be able to shape up a particular issue and an agenda the way that needs to happen. What that does mean, though, is, and I say this particularly to this audience in Chatham House, that kind of leadership based on real politics, the G7 countries, as though they are the kind of sole kind of notion of style of leadership that we need to lobby towards. I think that's all disrupting. I think it's needing to understand that leadership isn't about formal power where it resides at the office of the Prime Minister or in fact the G7 countries. It actually resides with people's movements. So I think unless we break down that sense of where power is and where it should sit and where we take inspiration from, I think we're going to have a hard time. Not impossible. And that's why I think, back to David's points around, who it is that's sitting on the decision making of international institutions. Some of that has to be lived experience. Some of that has to be experience of people leading movements. Some of that has to be hard power. You know, it needs to be a mix of many different things. Where I think it is being supported and put forward in a way that I think is helpful is from Sweden, although recently their government has put forward motions to strike down feminist foreign policy decision-making in that country. But at least that's one country that's talking seriously about redistribution and sharing power and decision-making, all the things that Sophia, you're talking about, decision-making and putting people who hold least power in most powerful decision-making roles. That's what Sweden is trying to do. It's called a feminist foreign policy agenda, of course. And of course, the other person that embodies some of that is our former Prime Minister from New Zealand. And she understood when to step away, when to give up power, not when it's so late that you've caused so much damage. But, you know, there are ways to do it. There are examples and pathways. So I remain hopeful.
Thank you. And Sophie, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do, and I think Halima's covered some really interesting points. So maybe I'll come at it from a slightly different angle. I think the kind of core of your question, like, yes, the system needs to change, but I think maybe the way of framing your question is like, can you change the system from the inside out, or do you change the system from the outside in? And I think the answer is both, right? So I'm going to take climate change as a good example here. So we've seen that kind of youth activists have been incredibly powerful at talking of that kind of decentralization of power. Youth activists like the Fridays for Future strikes have been incredibly powerful at moving governments towards more political appetite to take action on climate change. But governments themselves are the ones who have to take the action. And that's why I think it's so important to get more young people into government and into decision-making positions within government too. And I'm just going to give a little shout out to the program that I'm currently working on, the Climate Youth Negotiator program, which trains young people to become climate change diplomats. And actually, I can see a couple of our first cohort on the call, Evelyn Agustin, and of course, one of my fellow co-founders of the program, Marie Claire. So it's lovely to have a part of the family here today. I think it's incredible what we've managed to achieve. So last year we worked with 26 countries. We trained and supported 50 young negotiators to attend COP27, so the last big UN climate change conference. And there they negotiated on behalf of their countries. So they didn't come in as inspirational speakers who like do a nice little tokenistic speech and then disappear. They were the actual negotiators on behalf of their countries. And in doing so, we saw the changes, right? We have several case studies where our young negotiators, because of the amazing young community that we built of young diplomats, because of the skills that we'd equipped them with, also the confidence they'd gotten by being part of our program, the very fact that they were there, lots of our negotiators come from lower income countries, so we support them with the cost of sending their negotiators to these big international climate change conferences. All of that meant that we actually shifted the dial. We saw things move forward where they wouldn't have done before. So I think you genuinely need some of these people in decision-making positions, because I totally agree that, you know, leadership is only one aspect of an organizational culture. And I'm going to talk about, you know, UN climate change conferences as an organization here. But actually, you also need a kind of body, like a critical mass of people in there who are shifting that conversation and changing it from the inside, as well as the people from the outside. So I have real hope. Yes, I totally believe it can be done. I think by bringing new voices, new faces into the system, they will then be able to change the system from the inside and work in collaboration with the people outside to make a system that's more equitable for everyone.
I think that's such interesting reflections there. I think I will continue to use my position as chair, because I do have one kind of burning question for David. You kind of spoke about how, although human rights are of course universal, they're often they're monopolized by the elites perhaps, and maybe not always accessible in terms of language or the protections they offer to everyone. I was kind of wondering, how do you think that human rights and the language of human rights can be made more accessible to people who are outside of maybe the elite or places where they are experiencing human rights harms, but maybe don't have the language to express that?
Yeah, thanks. That's such a great question. I mean, I think human rights offer us lots of useful tools for making progress in many of the areas that we're talking about now, but in many ways, and I think it's not just, you know, people on the streets who find this, but but regulators and companies and so on, they've been so obscured by legal complexity that they become kind of almost impenetrable and feel a bit useless. And I often describe the human rights field in my flippant way as a kind of fight between lawyers and journalists, because I think those two strands are very much part of it. So on the one hand, we've got the kind of legal paradigm of human rights, and that's where all of the complexity is. But in a sense, that's also where the usefulness of human rights lies in so many ways. I mean, we've seen the extent to which the climate movement has been depending upon human rights in litigation, because the human rights laws and standards are there and they're applicable and they're useful, and can be litigated. But on the other hand, human rights is kind of a language of moral urgency about the world that we want to see. And when you read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's clear, it's simple, it's understandable, and the ideals in it kind of resonate with the heart. And I think, you know, we need to get better at reclaiming the moral urgency of human rights and not just surrendering it to the lawyers, to the elite institutions, and so on. But I think that's happening. And I think, you know, people do, we had a roundtable as part of this project I talked about at Chatham House last year on human rights and inequalities. And one of the folks who was there said very memorably, you know, people talk about human rights in the slums and the informal settlements. These are ideals that resonate with people and give a way of articulating the hopes for a more just, equitable, inclusive world. And the closer you get to power, the more all of that kind of fades. So I think what you're talking about perhaps is, you know, slightly turning down the dial on the lawyers and turning it up a bit on the narratives people. But it's both of the ingredients are there within human rights. It's just a question of emphasis.
It's really interesting. I think we've got some questions coming in the chat box, so please do keep posting there. Like I said, put your hand up if you would like to speak. The first one is from Maheen Razul, who's got a question, I think for Halima here, more about kind of representation again. Maheen says, when marginalized people come into politics or international organizations, from a normative point of view, are they responsible, morally liable to advocate for people like them if they're from a certain community? I think that's a really tricky question, but if you have any thoughts at all, that would be very welcome.
It's a really easy answer for me, though. There's a clue in the word representative. If you are representing a group of people, I think, yes, it is morally incumbent on you to represent the people that are most like you, of course. I think what the question really is about is whether you should then be promoting equity and inclusion as well. And I think the answer is yes. Again, the very best of our leaders often represent beyond their immediate issues because they want to lead for everyone. There is a particular challenge, I think, in the UK at the moment. That's probably where the question is coming from, around particular minority leaders being in positions of great power, I would say, and whether they should do more for their communities. I think if you can ask a white liberal leader to do more for racialized communities, I think you can most certainly ask a leader of color to do the same. Of course, being representative itself is not enough, which is why I spoke about the need to carry a mandate through. Now, if you look back at Margaret Thatcher's tenureship, she was a great prime minister by international accounts, but a lot of people would say through insider channels that she didn't do a great deal amount for gender. Actually, had she done more for gender, I think I would have said she's a great leader as opposed to just a great leader. So I do think it's incumbent on particular leaders who are representative of their constituent communities to lead more inclusively, because otherwise, what you say you making of your representative value. Where I think there's a particular danger for minority leaders, though, is where there isn't enough of a kind of buy-in and political support for that agenda. So if you are then striking out on diversity and inclusion by yourself and there isn't that support there, you will implode in your leadership journey. And I think that will be unfair. So I think there's a greater responsibility then on the organization and the wider leadership team to make sure that particular leaders who are supporting inclusion are supported well.
That's really interesting to hear your perspective there, especially because it's something that you touched on a bit in your presentation. We've got a question says, this one's for you, Sophie, but relevance to anyone who would like to answer. This is from Marcel Ascui. I apologize if I mispronounce your last name. And this seems to be a question of kind of prioritization, because Marcel says, both the relevance of minority access and the inclusion of young people in governance and leadership both seem to contribute a lot to their respective contexts at different levels. But should we be putting more emphasis on young people to create more dynamism and sustainable change, as opposed to sustaining ethnic, identitarian, racial, etc. minorities? So I think a question more about the priorities. Do you focus on young people as a whole, or do you focus on different subsets of young people, I believe?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much, Marcus, for the question as well. I think there's something really interesting in what you've kind of happened upon there, or articulated there, which is that youth is kind of both transient and yet universal, and I'll explain a little bit why. So actually, as part of the work on the G7, I was invited to interview Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister, and at the end of during our interview, one of the things he said to me is, the good thing about young people, Sophie, is that all young people turn into old people, and all old people were once young people. Now, make of that what you will. I did kind of think, yes, Prime Minister, that is the process of aging. But importantly, all of us were once younger, right? So if you reach the age of 28, you were previously 27. And that means that there's a kind of common universal thread amongst all of us of having been a young person and often seeing the world in the kind of, idealistic but also kind of optimistic light that young people often bring to the table. But equally, in the opposite direction, is that you don't stay a young person forever, unlike many of the other kind of minority groups that we argue for in terms of inclusive governance, kind of race or sex. Then actually, you don't stay a young person for the rest of your life. And so it can be one of these things where actually it feels a little bit kind of exclusionary, because you might come across leadership at the age of 36, and lo and behold, you're no longer a young person. I think the beauty of using youth as a kind of vehicle into more inclusion in decision making is I think what actually has been written as an addendum is that actually kind of whether you are a Black young person, whether you are a Jewish young person, whether you are a trans young person, you are all young people. And whilst we can't say that young people have homogenous views, that would be really irresponsible of us, there is something binding between you that you are all young people, and you're going through the world at a similar point in time. And so I think there is something about intersectionality that youth as a lens can bring that is, I think, really powerful, as opposed to individual lenses. But the other angle is, I genuinely think that by making things accessible to young people, you also make things accessible to all people. So lots of the things that we are talking about are also issues that affect many other minority groups. And so once you've kind of removed some of those barriers, you can actually enable proper participation from across the spectrum of society. And so I think, I guess maybe it wasn't really a question, I don't think there, Marcus, but I think Marcel, sorry, I've said your name incorrectly twice now, Marcel. I think I kind of really value that reflection, but it's nuanced, and I think it does sort of depend on the context and the time, but I think it's a really useful lens for looking at decision making.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely interesting reflections there. Marcel says, fair enough, thank you. I think we've got one from Taiwo Afolabi, who asks, how is human rights important to public policy? And I think if I could add a little addendum there, I would kind of ask, how can we embed human rights even at more local levels, local, regional, national, as opposed to thinking of it as some international United Nations structure?
Thanks. Thanks, Taiwo. It's a really pertinent question. And I think, there's a lot that we could say, but I would just highlight 2 points. I think one is that human rights are important in terms of the kind of expectations that we can have of government, including in terms of creating more equitable societies. So the rights that are enshrined in the human rights framework are really sort of powerful, helpful ideals around, well, there are many, but to give a couple of examples, the right to water and sanitation, the right to housing, and so on and so forth. These are things that people have a right to expect their governments to deliver. So on the one hand, there's the kind of the end goals, if you like. The other aspect is the sort of the process of negotiating and securing these things, and human rights are also about participation and the participation of people in decisions that lead to governments getting things done. So human rights are about are about people's participation in processes and civil society's participation in processes, but also about holding open the space for protest and for calling out the abuse of power, holding governments accountable, and so on. So they're both really powerful, I think, in terms of describing the world that we want to have, and in terms of the process of realizing that. How do we make it more localized and less UN and wonkish? I mean, it already is, right? Human rights are there in the laws, constitutions of practically every country in the world. There are already huge numbers of tools that can be used, and often local authorities are also very responsive to kind of human rights based appeals. So I think that's partly a question of perception, and the beauty of human rights, if you like, is that it is a universal framework and language, which has lots of different localized expressions as well. I'll stop there.
No, I think that's really useful. I think that definitely answered the question really well. And I'm very conscious we are coming up onto the hour almost exactly, and I don't want us to run over. So I will stop us here, unfortunately. I just want to say a massive, massive thank you to our three speakers for giving such a whirlwind tour of the big challenges, potential solutions, and some of the nuances that are relevant to achieving more inclusive governance. For CFC members, I really hope that's helpful in developing your ideas on the platform. Just a reminder, we will be opening the solutions phase of the challenge tomorrow. So please do start thinking of your policy proposals so we can hopefully share a few in the coming weeks at the Policymaker. I've just shared the link for the platform, and I will also share a few upcoming events at Chatham House, which are increasingly relevant to the conversations we've been having. Yes, Halima, thank you for posting your Instagram, sorry, not Instagram, your Twitter, and I'll make sure tomorrow in our newsletter that I'll post the links to the social medias of our speakers so you can follow along. And absolutely, yeah. So I think that's it. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.